Dear Excellencies, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear Cardinal Turkson and the Archbishop Sorondo, thanks for inviting me to this seminar today. I think after the big political year 2015, this seminar is another indicator that the Holy See will take the climate issue serious also post-2015, post-Paris, and we are happy to continue working together to get our messages out. Talking about messages out, for us in CITSE, as the International Alliance of Catholic Development Organizations, it's important to look at the climate debate through Laudato Si. And I would like to share with you today mainly how we can see it makes a difference to enter the climate discourse through the lens of Catholic social teaching, through the lens of Laudato Si. First of all, the Church has a particular look at issues. We always look at the challenges in the world from a viewpoint of the entire humanity. We do not look isolated to certain groups in our societies, we look at the entire humanity, and when we look at justice questions, every single person on this planet counts. We base our analysis in our work in CITSE as development organizations and social justice organizations, but also in Laudato Si, we can see it makes a major difference to put the poorest at the center of any policy, of any decision, and also in the climate context, because the poorest are the most vulnerable. The poorest are the ones hit the hardest, as we could see thanks to Father Peter, and they contributed the least to climate change. But we shall not look at them only as victims. The perspective of the poor is a central and prominent theme throughout Laudato Si and the work of many organizations in the world. We can look at climate change as a further affliction on the poor, as a further manifestation of social inequality. Because of the direct consequences of climate change, the poor and vulnerable cannot live their life in dignity. And as a representative of a Catholic social justice organization, I can say that climate change is today destroying and washing away a great deal of the solidarity work we have done over the past decades. And it requires major efforts from all of us working in the field of development cooperation and social justice. Climate change is not only causing or exaggerating problems, climate change is also a demonstration that our today's economic system is not working for the people and the planet. Many indicators, social as environmental, confirm this since decades, but we ignored them. We also tried to ignore climate change, but we cannot. Climate change is a global threat to humankind, created by humankind. And we want to escape devastating impacts on most of world population, we need to act. The related challenge is, though, that we cannot overcome the climate crisis with quick and easy solutions, despite its urgency. We find ourselves, as Pope Francis says, in a time of environmental crisis, but this crisis is far from being an isolated one. In a message that is notable for binding together the ecological and social justice crises, the encyclical makes clear that climate change is a symptom of the underlying social injustice and inequalities we are facing. Pope Francis looks at two types of suffering, the suffering of the people and the suffering of creation. To truly understand the crises we are facing, Laudato Si calls on us to listen to the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth. Two cries who are actually one cry, as we heard already earlier today in the discussions. This is important to consider and to take into account when we look at the climate crisis and we look at integral ecology. A political and economic sphere driven by vested interests has preserved the wealth and the power of a few, in the process degrading and damaging what should be the common good of humanity. The climate and the atmosphere are a common good, and we cannot allow a minority of world population to hijack it. Resources belong to everyone, but are managed by a few. This injustice allowed a minority of world population to base its wealth on fossil fuels and to tell the world that this is development, that this is progress, that this is a wealth everybody shall strive for. Human rights violations and environmental degradation are products of the values of an extractivist economic and social model and a throwaway culture, stemming from the notion that everything is simply our property. This vision of might is right has engendered immense inequality, injustice, and acts of violence across the world. We can see that in our daily work, working with local communities worldwide, how strongly they are affected by the extractivist model, by the interventions on the ground. And we have developed a kind of consumption model which exploits our natural resources, which creates major emissions, often for products and things we actually do not need. For flying around the world for leisure, for overconsumption of meat, for producing products nobody needs, we have created a culture of consumption which is harming the planet and people worldwide. So how can we overcome the climate crisis and the underlying paradigm? Pope Francis is telling us that we need to think about what kind of world we want to leave to our children. We can no longer, quoting him, we can no longer speak of sustainable development apart from intergenerational solidarity. Once we start to think about the kind of world we are leaving to future generations, we look at things differently. We realize that the world is a gift which we have freely received and must share with others. Intergenerational solidarity is not optional. It is a question of justice, since the world we have received belongs also to those who will follow us. A second pillar of response shall be to put solidarity at the heart of our responses to global crises and a new, renewed understanding of it. For this, it's good to go actually to look not only into Laudato Si, but also to look into Evangelii Gaudium, where Pope Francis is clarifying that solidarity today means A, to eliminate the structural causes of poverty, B, to promote the integral development of the poor, as well C, to show small acts of solidarity to encounter the challenges we are facing. The next challenge is now how to address this in the mitigation and climate efforts. From a Tsitse point of view, we have made the experience that the responses to the climate crisis work the best when they come from the people, when they come from the local communities, when we scale up and we build our responses from what already exists. We do not believe in the big solutions, in the new technologies, in new innovations which will save us. We believe that the responses are already there. In our daily work as development organizations, we are funding these solutions since decades. But unfortunately, on the ground, these solutions get marginalized, get discredited. Local communities experience violence, marginalization, exclusion in their societies. Some are even called in their countries terrorists. And we were very happy when we saw last year when the Pontifical Council Justice and Peace had invited some of the most affected communities in the world to the Vatican to listen to them and also to give them a voice. I think this is a particular role the Catholic Church can play to give those who are the drivers of change a voice. Some predecessors today spoke already about the challenge to focus too much on technocentric solutions, as Pope Francis does. For us, we can see that every day that there are new approaches promoted to respond to climate change who do not serve the people and who do not serve climate and the planet. This is one of the major weaknesses actually of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement has very strong ambitions around well below 2 degrees, aiming at 1.5 degrees. And I think we as Catholic Church, we can also be proud that we actively supported the most vulnerable countries in the world in their call for the 1.5 degrees objective. But de facto, the Paris Agreement in the last 48 hours, all the text which was trying to safeguard actually human rights, food security, all the measures which would explain what actually needs to be done to address the climate crisis were eliminated from the text. So the text is telling us, giving us the goals of reduction, but the Agreement of Paris is not telling us how actually to bring to fight climate change that it serves people and the planet. This is a major weakness. Everything around coal, around oil and fossil fuels, everything about what kind of agriculture is needed, what kind of energy is needed, everything had been deleted from the text. This was a great disappointment to our organizations. We also addressed today the issue of decarbonization. Of course, what we can find in the text, the decarbonization by end of century, as others said already, is not enough. Decarbonization by 2050 is science-based and is what we need to do if we want to stay well below 2 degrees. What is lacking is now the accountability of governments to get done the things which we have agreed. Governments agreed to stay well below 2 degrees, but we cannot see much evidence to be on the right track. Emissions are still increasing continuously, and the governments who came to Paris with their INDCs, we know that the INDCs they brought to Paris were not sufficient. We monitor, together with other NGO alliances, we monitor governments' policies put in place to meet the INDCs. We cannot see that these political measures are on target of the voluntarily set INDCs. And if we really want to stay well below 2 degrees, we need ambitions that go far beyond the INDCs. And of course, we can acknowledge that the Chinese and the US announcement to ratify the Paris Agreement is and was a very important signal to the world to take action. But we also need to be honest that the Chinese and the US measures put in place today and the targets they have announced will not put us on a 2 degrees road. We are rather on a 4 degrees road. So let me conclude with a very few remarks on Marrakesh. I think that Marrakesh needs to bring back the spirit of ambition. Many governments tend at the moment to say, yeah, you know, the Paris Agreement coming into place 2020, let's wait for the different reviews and the dialogues coming up, and actually we cannot see real climate action. Also in Europe, I'm based in Brussels, the EU has at the moment climate issues not as a priority and has not even ratified Paris so far. It will ratify later than the US, later than China, which is a devastating signal for a former climate champion in the world. In Marrakesh, I believe there is space for progress around human rights, about land issues, what kind of agriculture we want to have in place. Agriculture is contributing 24% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world, so we need to talk about agriculture. We cannot only talk about energy. We need to talk about, as I said, about human rights. And looking beyond Marrakesh, I think Marrakesh can prepare already the upcoming key meetings which will follow the IPCC special report on how to reach the 1.5 degrees goal. I think that your report is fundamental to help us to understand the transition of our economies, of our lifestyles, of our social setup, the dimension, the degree of change we need to undertake. This IPCC report is expected with great attention by civil society, by us, by many people in the world, because this report will help us a lot to understand the massive transformation we have ahead of us. Thank you very much.